The sun cast its golden rays across the dusty horizon as Abigail Montgomery stepped down from the train, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. It was 1878, and the small town of Cottonwood Springs, Arizona Territory, spread before her a collection of wooden buildings and hitching posts that would now be her home. She clutched the letter from her late father's attorney, the paper crumpled from being read countless times during her journey from Boston. The Silver Spur Ranch awaits its rightful heir, it had promised. The platform was nearly empty now, passengers having been greeted by loved ones or disappeared into town. Only Abigail remained, her trunk at her feet, bonnet strings fluttering in the hot, dry breeze. She'd expected anyone to meet her, but as minutes stretched into an hour, her courage began to waver, hands trembling from exhaustion and uncertainty. "Miss Montgomery?" The deep voice startled her from behind. Abigail whirled around to face a tall man dressed in trail-worn clothes, dusty denim, a faded shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed piercing green eyes. His face was weathered by sun and wind, yet he couldn't have been more than 30 years old. "Yes, that's me," she managed, straightening her back despite her fatigue. "Ezra Vaughn." He touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Foreman at Silver Spur. Sorry I'm late." He studied her briefly, his expression unreadable. "Your father's lawyer sent word you'd be arriving today." "My father," the words caught in her throat. She'd never known Jackson Montgomery, the father who'd abandoned her mother before she was born, only to die and leave Abigail his ranch in a twist of fate that had uprooted her life. Ezra's eyes softened slightly at her discomfort. Without another word, he bent down and lifted her heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Ranch is about 10 miles out. Wagons ready?" He nodded toward the end of the platform. "This way." Abigail followed, her hands still trembling, exhaustion and anxiety washing over her in equal measure. When they reached the wagon, Ezra loaded her trunk and then offered his hand to help her up to the seat. His palm was calloused but warm against her gloved fingers. "I imagine you're wondering why nobody else came to meet you," he said as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "The thought did cross my mind," Abigail admitted. Ezra clicked his tongue and the horses started forward. "Folks at the ranch are adjusting to the idea of Jackson Montgomery's daughter suddenly appearing to claim everything." He glanced at her. "Most didn't even know you existed until the lawyer read the will." "I didn't know about them either," Abigail said quietly. "Or the ranch. I thought my father was dead long ago." "He might as well have been, for all the time he spent there these past years." Ezra's voice held an edge of bitterness. He was more interested in cards and whiskey in town than cattle and horses at Silver Spur. The wagon rumbled down the main street of Cottonwood Springs. Abigail took in the false-fronted buildings, the saloon with its swinging doors, the general store with barrels on its porch. Men stopped to stare at her. A well-dressed Eastern woman was still a novelty in these parts. "Is it far?" she asked, suddenly aware of how out of place her traveling clothes were for the desert heat. "Far enough?" Ezra kept his eyes on the road. "Hope you're not expecting much. Silver Spur's seen better days." As they left town behind, the landscape opened before them, vast stretches of scrubby grass, cacti standing like sentinels, distant mountains shimmering in the heat. It was beautiful in its harshness, nothing like the green hills of Massachusetts that Abigail had known all her 23 years. "Why did you stay?" she asked suddenly. "If my father was as poor a rancher as you suggest," Ezra's jaw tightened, "someone had to keep things running." After a moment he added, "I made a promise to your grandfather before he passed. Said I'd look after the place." "My grandfather?" Abigail turned to him in surprise. "You knew him?" "Thomas Montgomery gave me my first job when I was 16, taught me everything I know about ranching." His voice softened with respect. "He built Silver Spur from nothing. Would have broken his heart to see what became of it under your father's care." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels creating a rhythmic crunch against the dirt road. Abigail's mind filled with questions about this family she'd never known, this legacy she'd inherited. "I should tell you," Ezra finally said. "The ranch is in trouble. Banks threatening foreclosure. Your father left debts, and the last cattle drive barely covered what we owed the hands." Abigail felt her stomach sink. "How long do we have?" 3 months, maybe 4. Ezra replied, "unless you're planning to sell." "Reginald Blackwell over at Diamond B Ranch has been trying to buy Silver Spur for years. He'd take it off your hands quick enough." "I have no intention of selling," Abigail said firmly, surprising even herself with her conviction. "I came here to understand who my father was, who I am. I won't leave until I've done that." Ezra gave her an appraising look. "No offense, Miss Montgomery, but what does a Boston lady know about running a cattle ranch?" "Absolutely nothing," she admitted. "But I'm a quick study, Mr. Vaughn, and I suspect you know everything there is to know." The ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "The hands won't take kindly to taking orders from a woman." "Then it's fortunate they'll be taking them from you while I learn." She met his gaze steadily. "That is, if you're willing to stay on." The wagon crested a hill, and suddenly the valley opened before them. A cluster of buildings came into view, a large ranch house with a wide porch, a barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, and a corral held several horses near the main house. "Silver Spur," Ezra announced, a note of pride in his voice despite his earlier words. Abigail felt something unexpected stir within her, a sense of connection to this wild, beautiful place. "It's lovely," she breathed. "It could be again," Ezra said, then fell silent as he guided the wagon down the slope toward the ranch. As they approached, several men emerged from the bunkhouse, watching with undisguised curiosity. Abigail straightened her back and lifted her chin, determined not to appear as overwhelmed as she felt. When the wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house, Ezra jumped down and came around to help her. As she placed her hands on his shoulders and felt his strong grip at her waist, lowering her to the ground, their eyes met briefly. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that they were now bound together by this land and its troubles. "Welcome home, Miss Montgomery," he said quietly, then turned to retrieve her trunk. Home. The word echoed in Abigail's mind as she gazed up at the weathered two-story house that was now hers. It looked tired but proud, much like the land itself. She took a deep breath of the sage-scented air and followed Ezra up the steps, crossing the threshold into her new life. The interior of the ranch house was dim and cool after the brightness outside. Ezra set her trunk down in the foyer and pushed his hat back on his head. "Martha," he called, "Miss Montgomery's arrived." A plump woman in her 50s hurried from what appeared to be the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her face broke into a welcoming smile. "Oh, Miss Montgomery, we've been expecting you." She bustled forward, taking Abigail's hands in her flour-dusted ones. "I'm Martha Hayes. I've been housekeeper here since your grandfather's time." "Please, call me Abigail," she replied, warmed by the woman's genuine welcome. "I've prepared the master bedroom for you. It was your grandfather's, though your father never used it. Preferred the room at the back, he did when he was here at all." Martha shot a meaningful look at Ezra, who merely nodded. "I'll have one of the boys bring up hot water for washing," Martha continued. "You must be exhausted from your journey. Dinner will be ready in an hour, nothing fancy, mind you, but hearty enough." "Thank you, Martha. That sounds perfect." Abigail began to remove her gloves, suddenly aware of how dirty and tired she must look. "I'll leave you to get settled," Ezra said, already moving toward the door. "We can discuss ranch business tomorrow." "Mr. Vaughn," Abigail called after him. "Thank you for meeting me today." He paused, hand on the doorknob. "Just doing my job, Miss Montgomery." With a slight nod, he was gone. Martha clicked her tongue. "Don't mind Ezra. He's been carrying this ranch on his shoulders for years. Not an easy burden." "He doesn't seem to think much of my father," Abigail observed as Martha led her up the stairs. "Your father had his troubles, dear. Gambling, drinking. After your grandmother died, he just seemed to lose his way." Martha pushed open a door at the end of the hallway. "But that's not for me to speak on. Here we are." The bedroom was large and airy, with windows overlooking the valley. A massive four-poster bed dominated one wall, a dresser, and washstand another. It was simply furnished, but comfortable. "I'll have your trunk brought up," Martha said. "Rest a bit, and I'll call you for dinner." Left alone, Abigail moved to the window and gazed out at Silver Spur. The afternoon sun bathed the land in golden light, casting long shadows from the outbuildings. Men moved about their tasks, leading horses, carrying feed. repairing equipment. Her men now, her responsibility. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. In the distance, she spotted Ezra. He had removed his hat and was talking to an older ranch hand, gesturing toward the hills. Even from this distance, she could see the respect with which the other man listened. Ezra Vaughn might not welcome her presence, but it was clear the ranch couldn't run without him. Abigail touched the glass of the window, cool beneath her fingertips. "I will learn," she whispered to herself. "I will not fail this place." Later, freshened up and wearing a simple blue dress from her trunk, Abigail made her way downstairs. Martha had prepared a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. To Abigail's surprise, Ezra joined them at the large kitchen table. "I usually take my meals with the hands," he explained, "but Martha insisted tonight was special." "Of course it's special," Martha huffed, setting down a bowl of stew in front of him. "It's not every day the rightful owner of Silver Spur comes home." Conversation flowed more easily over dinner. Martha was full of stories about the ranch's better days under Thomas Montgomery's management, the cattle drives to Tucson, the breeding of fine quarter horses, the Christmas celebrations when the house was full of neighbors and laughter. "Your grandfather was a respected man in these parts," Martha told Abigail. "Built this ranch with nothing but hard work and determination." "And your grandmother Elizabeth was the heart of Silver Spur," she continued. "Taught school in town, nursed half the county through various ailments. When she passed from pneumonia 10 years ago, something in your father just broke." Ezra remained mostly quiet, but Abigail noticed how he listened intently to these stories of the past. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Your grandfather always said the land chooses its people, not the other way around." He met Abigail's gaze across the table. "Maybe it's choosing you now to set things right." "I hope so," she replied softly, "though I'm not sure where to begin." "You begin by learning," Ezra said simply. "Everything else follows from that." After dinner, Ezra excused himself to check on a pregnant mare in the barn. Abigail helped Martha clear the dishes, despite the older woman's protests. "I'll not have the mistress of Silver Spur washing up on her first night," Martha exclaimed. "I'm hardly a mistress of anything yet," Abigail laughed. "And I've always believed in doing my share of work." Martha studied her thoughtfully. "You're not what I expected, Abigail Montgomery." "What did you expect?" "Some fancy Eastern miss who'd sell up at the first opportunity." Martha smiled warmly. "I'm glad to be wrong." Later, as the evening cooled, Abigail found herself drawn to the porch. The vast sky above Silver Spur was ablaze with stars more than she'd ever seen in Boston. The air smelled of dust and sage, punctuated by the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. She wasn't alone for long. Boots thudded on the wooden planks, and Ezra appeared, a steaming cup in each hand. He offered one to her without a word. "Thank you," Abigail said, breathing in the rich aroma of coffee. "It's beautiful out here." "It grows on you," Ezra agreed, leaning against a porch post. "Some find it too empty, but I've always thought there's a sort of fullness to it." "I understand what you mean," Abigail said, surprised to find that she did. "It feels alive." They stood in companionable silence for a while, sipping their coffee. "Tomorrow," Ezra finally said, "I'll show you the books such as they are. You should know what you're facing." "That bad?" "Could be worse." He shrugged. "We've got a decent herd, good breeding stock. The problem's cash flow. Your father—" He stopped, as if realizing he was about to speak ill of her parent. "Please don't spare my feelings about my father, Mr. Vaughn," Abigail said firmly. "I never knew him. I need the truth if I'm to make things right." Ezra studied her for a long moment. "Your father mortgaged the ranch twice over to cover gambling debts. Used the Silver Spur brand as collateral for loans he never repaid. The only reason we still have this land is that Judge Wilson at the bank had too much respect for your grandfather to foreclose." Abigail absorbed this information with a heavy heart. "And this Judge Wilson's patience is running thin?" "He's given us until the fall roundup. If we can drive enough cattle to market to make a payment on the principal, he'll extend the terms." Ezra's voice was matter-of-fact, but Abigail could sense the tension beneath. "Can we do it?" "Maybe, with luck, hard work, and no disasters." He drained his cup. "We lost 30 head last month to rustlers. Can't afford that again." "Rustlers?" Abigail's eyes widened. "Like in the dime novels?" Ezra actually smiled then. A brief flash of white teeth in the darkness. Real-life bandits are less romantic than in those stories, Miss Montgomery. Just desperate men stealing to survive or organized gangs working for bigger outfits. Do you know who's behind it? I have my suspicions. His expression hardened. Reginald Blackwell would benefit most from Silver Spur failing. Diamond B Ranch borders our best water rights. The man you mentioned might buy the ranch? The very same. Ezra straightened up. I can't prove he's behind the rustling, but the timing is convenient. A coyote howled in the distance, its lonely call echoing across the valley. Abigail shivered slightly, though the night was warm. You should get some rest, Ezra said, noticing her reaction. Tomorrow will be a full day. Mr. Vaughn, Abigail said as he turned to leave. I want to thank you for staying on all these years, despite my father's difficulties. Silver Spur would be lost without you. Ezra paused, his expression unreadable in the starlight. Like I said, I made a promise. After a moment, he added, Good night, Miss Montgomery. Good night, Mr. Vaughn. As his footsteps faded toward the bunkhouse, Abigail remained on the porch, gazing out at her inheritance, the land, the troubles, the beauty, and the burdens. Tomorrow she would begin to learn what it meant to be a Montgomery of Silver Spur Ranch. The following days passed in a whirlwind of information and new experiences. True to his word, Ezra showed Abigail the ranch books, ledgers filled with her father's careless handwriting and increasingly desperate financial arrangements. The picture they painted was grim, but not hopeless. We need about $2,000 by September to satisfy the bank, Ezra explained as they sat at the ranch office desk. If we can get a good price for the yearlings at market, we might make it. And if we don't? Abigail asked. Then Blackwell gets his wish one way or another. Abigail refused to accept defeat so easily. There must be other options. What about the horses? My father's attorney mentioned Silver Spur was once known for its quarter horses. Something like respect flickered in Ezra's eyes. You've got your grandfather's thinking. Yes, we still have some of the bloodline, including Thunder, your grandfather's prize stallion. His offspring fetch good prices. Then let's focus on that too, Abigail said decisively. And I need to learn everything about this ranch. Not just the books, but the land, the livestock, everything. Ezra raised an eyebrow. That's not typical for the owner to concern themselves with. I'm not a typical owner, Abigail replied, and Silver Spur isn't in a typical situation. From that day forward, Abigail rose before dawn, determined to immerse herself in ranch life. She insisted on accompanying Ezra on his daily rounds, observing everything with keen interest. She wore the most practical clothes. She had divided riding skirts and sturdy blouses, though they were still woefully unsuited for ranch work. The hands were initially skeptical, some openly hostile to taking direction from a woman, but Abigail approached them with respect and a willingness to learn that gradually won them over. Old Pete, who had worked the ranch since her grandfather's day, became a particular ally, filling her evenings with stories of Silver Spur's glory days. Your grandmother would be proud, he told her one evening as they sat on the porch. She had that same look in her eye, determined as a bulldog but gentle as a dove when needed. Ezra proved to be a patient teacher, though his manner remained reserved. He showed her how to read the land, to understand the rhythms of the cattle, to spot signs of trouble before it developed. He taught her to ride properly, not the genteel posting trot of her Boston riding lessons, but the practical seat of a working rider who might spend 12 hours in the saddle. One morning, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Ezra met her at the corral with a beautiful chestnut mare. Time you had your own mount, he said, holding the reins out to her. This is Penny. She's steady but spirited, a good combination. Abigail approached the mare, stroking her velvety nose. She's beautiful. She's yours, Ezra replied. Every rancher needs a horse they can trust. The gift touched Abigail deeply. It was an acknowledgement that, despite her inexperience, Ezra was beginning to see her as a genuine part of Silver Spur. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Let's see if you can keep up today. We're riding the north boundary to check fences. The day was long and physically demanding. They rode for miles, Ezra pointing out landmarks and teaching Abigail to identify different types of grasses and their value for grazing. When they found sections of fence cut clear evidence of rustlers, his expression darkened. "Third time this month," he muttered as he dismounted to examine the clean cuts in the wire. "This isn't random. They're targeting us specifically." "Blackwell?" Abigail asked, joining him by the broken fence. "Can't prove it," Ezra said grimly, pulling repair tools from his saddlebag. "But who else would benefit?" Together they repaired the fence. Abigail's inexperienced hands soon blistered, but working steadily alongside Ezra's capable ones. As they worked, she found herself increasingly aware of him, the strength in his sun-browned arms, the concentration in his green eyes, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. It was dangerous territory, she knew. Ezra Vaughn was her employee, and Silver Spur's survival depended on their working relationship. Yet, she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest when their hands occasionally brushed, or the way she found herself seeking his approval with each new skill mastered. On the ride back to the ranch house, they paused atop a ridge overlooking Silver Spur. The setting sun painted the buildings in shades of gold and amber, the distant mountains purple against the horizon. "I'm beginning to understand why you stayed," Abigail said softly. "Even when my father made it difficult." Ezra's gaze swept across the valley. "This land gets in your blood," he replied. "Thomas Montgomery used to say we don't really own it, we're just its caretakers for a time." "Is that why you never started your own ranch? Because you feel responsible for this one?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment. "Partly," he finally said, "and partly because—" He hesitated, then shook his head. "We should get back. Martha will have dinner waiting." Abigail wanted to press him further, but sensed he'd said all he was willing to say for now. As they rode down the slope toward home, she wondered what secrets Ezra Vaughn kept behind his stoic exterior, and why the thought of discovering them made her heart beat faster. The weeks passed, and July melted into August. The heat was relentless, the work never ending, but Abigail found herself thriving. Her soft hands grew calloused, her fair skin tanned despite her wide-brimmed hat, and her confidence grew daily. She learned to recognize each cow in the breeding herd by sight, to predict storms by the feel of the air, to move cattle with voice and presence rather than just force. Martha had taken her into town to buy more suitable clothes, sturdy denim, practical shirts and boots that could withstand the rigors of ranch work. The townspeople had regarded her with curiosity at first, but word spread quickly that Jackson Montgomery's daughter was working to save Silver Spur, not sell it, and their reception warmed. One evening, as August drew to a close, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with Ezra, reviewing their preparations for the fall roundup. The tally of cattle was promising, but the persistent problem of rustling continued to threaten their margins. "If we lose any more before the drive, we'll miss our target," Ezra said, frustration evident in his voice. "We need to catch whoever's behind this." "Could we set a trap?" Abigail suggested. "Move some of the herd to the north pasture as bait, then keep watch?" Ezra looked up sharply, surprise and something like admiration in his eyes. "That's exactly what I was thinking. But it would be dangerous. These men don't hesitate to use their guns." "Then we'll be careful," Abigail said firmly. "And we won't confront them directly, just gather evidence to take to the sheriff." "We?" Ezra's eyebrow rose. "There's no we in this plan, Miss Montgomery. This is men's work." Abigail felt a flash of indignation. "This is my ranch, Mr. Vaughn, and my responsibility. I won't ask the hands to take risks I'm not willing to share." They locked eyes across the table, neither willing to yield. Finally, Ezra sighed. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said, but there was a reluctant smile in his voice. "Your grandfather would say the same, and he'd mean it as a compliment." "Then I'll take it as one," Abigail replied, smiling back. Their plan took shape over the next few days. They moved 50 head of cattle to the isolated north pasture prime targets for rustlers. The hands would take turns keeping watch from hidden positions, with strict instructions to observe only, not engage. Abigail insisted on taking a shift herself, despite Ezra's continued objections. "At least let me stay with you," he finally conceded when he saw she wouldn't be dissuaded. They took the midnight to dawn watch, positioned in a small hollow overlooking the pasture. The night was cool, the stars brilliant overhead. They sat side by side, wrapped in blankets against the pre-dawn chill, rifles across their laps. The cattle were dark shapes in the moonlight, occasionally shifting or lowing softly. "Tell me about Boston," Ezra said quietly as they waited. "What was your life like there?" Abigail thought for a moment. "Structured, predictable. My mother and I lived with her sister after my father left. Aunt Harriet was determined I would make a good match, so my days were filled with lessons, music, art, deportment, all the things a proper lady should know." "And were you a proper lady?" There was a teasing note in Ezra's voice. "Hardly," Abigail laughed softly. "I spent every spare moment reading history, science, adventure stories. My aunt despaired of my unfeminine interests, as she called them." "What about suitors? Surely you had your share." Abigail picked at a loose thread on her blanket. "There was one. Harold Winthrop, the son of a shipping magnate, very respectable. We were practically engaged when I received the letter about my inheritance." "What happened?" "He expected me to sell Silver Spur unseen and return to Boston with the proceeds as his bride." Abigail's voice hardened at the memory. "When I insisted on coming here first, he gave me an ultimatum, him or the ranch. I chose the ranch." Ezra was silent for a moment. "You gave up a secure future for a failing ranch you'd never seen." "I gave up a life planned by others for a chance to make my own decisions," Abigail corrected. "Even if I ultimately fail here, at least the choice will have been mine." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft nickering from their horses tethered nearby. Ezra immediately tensed, raising a hand for silence. In the pasture below, the cattle were growing restless, moving in a way that suggested disturbance. "Someone's there," he whispered, raising his rifle not to fire but to use the scope for better vision in the darkness. Abigail peered into the night. At first she saw nothing, but then shadowy figures materialized at the edge of the pasture men on horseback, moving with practiced efficiency to separate several cattle from the herd. "4 of them," Ezra breathed. "Professional job." They watched as the rustlers worked, quietly cutting out 10 head and beginning to move them toward the broken section of fence. As the men passed through a patch of moonlight, Ezra suddenly stiffened beside her. "That's Blackwell's foreman," he hissed. "Jake Mercer, and those are Diamond B horses." "We have our proof," Abigail whispered back, excitement mingling with fear. "Should we alert the others?" "Too far. By the time they got here, the rustlers would be gone." Ezra's face was grim in the moonlight. "We need to follow them, see where they take the cattle. That will be evidence enough for the sheriff." It was a dangerous proposition, but Abigail nodded her agreement. They waited until the rustlers had moved the stolen cattle through the fence and started north, then crept back to their horses. "Stay close," Ezra murmured as they mounted. "If anything happens, you ride for the ranch, no heroics." They followed at a safe distance, keeping to the shadows of ridges and stands of scrub pine. The rustlers moved with confidence, clearly familiar with the territory. After about an hour, they approached a small box canyon that Abigail recognized as being on Diamond B land. "Just as I thought," Ezra said softly as they watched from a concealed position. "They're using this canyon as a holding pen. See those other cattle? I'd bet my life those are Silver Spur brands." In the pre-dawn light, Abigail could make out a larger herd, already penned in the canyon, guarded by 2 more men. The stolen cattle were added to this group, the gate secured, and the rustlers dismounted to accept canteens from their companions. "We've seen enough," Ezra said. "Let's get back and send for the sheriff." They turned their horses carefully, moving as quietly as possible away from the canyon. But just as they reached the ridge, Abigail's mount Penny stepped on a loose stone, sending it clattering down the slope. "Who's there?" a sharp voice called from below. "Ride!" Ezra commanded, spurring his horse forward. Abigail followed, bent low over Penny's neck as they galloped across the open ground. Behind them came shouts and the thunder of pursuing hooves. A shot cracked through the air, wide of its mark but close enough to send a chill through Abigail's blood. Ezra led them on a zigzag course through rocky terrain, using his knowledge of the land to their advantage. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the desert, they finally lost their pursuers in a maze of small canyons. Breathing hard, they pulled their horses to a walk in a sheltered draw. Ezra's face was taut with concern as he turned to Abigail. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her heart still racing. "They saw us." "They saw someone," Ezra corrected. Not necessarily us, but we need to move quickly now. Blackwell will know his operation is compromised. They rode hard for Silver Spur, reaching the ranch as the hands were gathering for breakfast. Ezra quickly explained what they had witnessed, sending one of the men to town to fetch Sheriff Taylor. By mid-morning, the sheriff had arrived, a grizzled man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He listened to their account with growing anger. "I've suspected Blackwell for years, but he's been too careful to catch," he said when they finished. "If what you say is true about that canyon, we finally have him." "It's true," Ezra said firmly. "I'll stake my reputation on it." Sheriff Taylor nodded. "I'll gather a posse. Vaughn, I'll need you to guide us to that canyon." "I'm coming too," Abigail stated, her tone brooking no argument. Both men started to object, but she cut them off. "Those are my cattle being stolen, my ranch being threatened. I have every right to be present when justice is served." The sheriff looked to Ezra, who after a moment's hesitation gave a reluctant nod. "She's earned the right," he said simply. By noon, a posse of 10 men plus Abigail had assembled at Silver Spur. They rode out with determination, the sheriff's badge glinting in the sunlight. As they approached Diamond B territory, they spread out to surround the canyon where the stolen cattle were held. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and decisive. Caught red-handed with clearly stolen cattle, Mercer and his men surrendered without bloodshed. The evidence was irrefutable, dozens of Silver Spur-branded cattle penned on Diamond B land, with Blackwell's own men guarding them. Reginald Blackwell himself arrived as the sheriff was securing the prisoners, his face purple with rage. He was a corpulent man in his 50s, expensively dressed despite the dust of the trail. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" he bellowed, riding into the canyon. "Sheriff, you are trespassing on my property." "And you, Mr. Blackwell, are in possession of stolen cattle," Sheriff Taylor replied evenly. "Your men have confessed to acting under your orders. You're under arrest for cattle rustling." Blackwell's eyes bulged. His gaze fell on Abigail, and his expression twisted with contempt. "This is your doing, isn't it? Jackson Montgomery's little girl, playing at being a rancher." He spat on the ground. "Silver Spur should have been mine years ago. Your father practically promised it to me in exchange for covering his gambling debts." "Yet somehow the deed remained with the Montgomery family," Ezra said coldly, moving his horse slightly in front of Abigail's. "And now it's going to stay there." The sheriff's men took Blackwell and his foreman into custody while arrangements were made to drive the stolen cattle back to Silver Spur. As the posse prepared to return to town, Sheriff Taylor approached Abigail. "You've got spine, Miss Montgomery," he said with grudging respect. "Your grandfather would be proud." "Thank you, Sheriff," Abigail replied, touched by the comparison. "Will the charges against Blackwell stand? With the evidence and confessions we have, he'll be lucky to avoid prison." The sheriff settled his hat more firmly on his head. "But be careful. Men like Blackwell have friends, and he won't take this humiliation lightly." As the sheriff rode off with his prisoners, Abigail turned to find Ezra watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I was just thinking," he said slowly, "that Thomas Montgomery couldn't have chosen a better heir for Silver Spur if he'd searched the whole country." The compliment warmed Abigail through and through. "It wasn't just me," she said. "Without you, the ranch would have been lost long ago." Their eyes held for a long moment, something new and undefined passing between them. Then Ezra cleared his throat and looked away. "We should get those cattle home," he said. "There's still a lot of work to do before the roundup." The ride back to Silver Spur was triumphant, with the recovered cattle driven ahead of them. Word of Blackwell's arrest spread quickly, and by the time they reached the ranch, the hands were waiting to celebrate. Martha prepared a special dinner, and for the first time since Abigail's arrival, there was a sense of hope and possibility in the air. As September approached, preparations for the fall roundup intensified. With the rustling problem solved, their projections looked increasingly positive. If prices held at the Tucson market, they would make enough to satisfy the bank and keep Silver Spur solvent. Abigail threw herself into the work with renewed vigor, determined to prove herself during this crucial test. She rode out with the hands every day, learning the skills needed for the roundup: how to cut cattle from the brush, how to keep the herd moving steadily, how to handle the inevitable challenges that arose. Ezra remained her primary teacher, but their relationship had subtly shifted since the night they had tracked the rustlers together. There was a new ease between them, a sense of partnership that transcended the employer-employee dynamic. Abigail found herself seeking his company even when ranch business didn't require it, and she often caught his eyes following her when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, about a week before the roundup was to begin, Abigail rode out alone to check on a pregnant mare in the south pasture. The sunset painted the landscape in fiery hues, the air cooling as twilight approached. After examining the mare, who seemed to be progressing normally, Abigail decided to take a longer route back to the ranch house, enjoying the peaceful end of the day. As she crested a small ridge, she was surprised to find Ezra there, seated on a boulder, gazing out at the land below. He turned at the sound of her approach, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "I didn't expect to find anyone out here," she said, dismounting to join him. "I come here sometimes," he replied, making room for her on the large rock. "Best view on the ranch." Abigail sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body in the cooling air. Below them spread the entirety of Silver Spur, the ranch buildings, the grazing lands, the distant glint of the creek that provided their precious water. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Yes." But when she turned, Ezra wasn't looking at the view, he was looking at her. Abigail felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Vaughn." "Ezra," he corrected gently. "I think we've moved beyond formalities, don't you?" She smiled. "Ezra, then. And I'm Abigail, not Miss Montgomery." "Abigail." He said her name as if testing how it felt on his tongue. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." Her pulse quickened. "Yes?" "Your grandfather." Ezra hesitated, then continued. "Before he died, he made me promise two things. First, to look after Silver Spur as best I could. Second, if Jackson ever had an heir who came to claim the ranch, to help them understand what this place truly means." "You've certainly kept both promises," Abigail said. "What I didn't tell you," Ezra continued, his voice low, "is why I stayed all these years, even when your father was running the ranch into the ground." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded paper worn at the creases from being opened many times. He handed it to Abigail. "What is this?" she asked, unfolding it carefully. "A deed," Ezra replied, "to 1/4 of Silver Spur. Your grandfather gave it to me the year before he died. Said I'd earned a stake in the place I'd helped build." Abigail stared at the document, Thomas Montgomery's bold signature clearly visible at the bottom. "But if you own part of Silver Spur, why didn't you say anything when I arrived? Why let me believe I owned it all?" Ezra's gaze returned to the landscape. "I wasn't sure what kind of person you'd be. If you'd be like your father, or if you'd truly care for the ranch. I wanted to see before I complicated things." "And now?" Abigail asked, her heart in her throat. "Now I know," he said simply, turning back to her. "You belong here, Abigail. As much as I do. Maybe more." There was something in his green eyes that made breathing difficult. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because after the roundup, things will change. Either we'll save Silver Spur together, or we'll lose it together." His hand found hers on the rock between them. "And because I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel." "And what do you feel?" Abigail whispered, though she thought she knew the answer from the way his thumb traced circles on her palm. "That meeting you at that train station was the best thing that ever happened to me," Ezra said, his voice rough with emotion. "That watching you fight for this land, learn to love it the way I do, has made me see you in a way I never expected." He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "I know it's not proper. I know there are a dozen reasons why this is a bad idea. But I can't help it, Abigail. I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Abigail felt tears spring to her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of the moment. "Ezra," she said softly, reaching up to touch his weather-lined face, "I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you took my trunk and nodded toward home." His smile was like sunrise after a long night. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Ezra leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Abigail responded, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Ezra rested his forehead against hers, his hands warm at her waist. "We should get back," he murmured. "The hands will talk if we're out here alone too long." "Let them talk," Abigail replied with a smile. "We're partners now, in every sense." They rode back to Silver Spur side by side, their future suddenly brighter than either could have imagined when Abigail first stepped off that train. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by their love for each other and for the land that had brought them together. The fall roundup was the hardest physical labor Abigail had ever experienced. For 10 days, she rose before dawn and worked until after dusk, helping to gather scattered cattle from across Silver Spur's vast acreage. Her muscles ached, her skin burned despite her hat and bandana, and each night she fell into exhausted sleep. Yet, she had never felt more alive. There was exhilaration in working alongside the hands as an equal, in seeing the growing herd that represented Silver Spur's salvation, in catching Ezra's proud glances when she mastered a new skill. Their relationship remained discreet during the roundup. There was simply too much work for private moments, and both agreed that the focus needed to be on the task at hand. But the hands weren't blind. They saw the way Ezra and Abigail gravitated toward each other, the silent communications that passed between them, the lingering touches when they thought no one was looking. Old Pete approached Abigail one evening as she brushed down Penny after a long day. "Don't you worry about what the others think," he said gruffly. "The boss has a right to happiness, and Ezra's a good man, the best I know." Abigail smiled, touched by the old cowboy's approval. "Thank you, Pete. That means a lot." The final tally exceeded their most optimistic projections, 300 head ready for the drive to Tucson, including some of the finest steers in the territory. If prices held, they would make enough to pay the bank and have operating capital for the coming year. The night before the drive was to begin, a celebration was held at the ranch. Martha outdid herself with a feast, and someone produced a fiddle. Under the stars, with lanterns illuminating the yard, the hands danced and sang, their spirits high with anticipated success. Ezra found Abigail watching from the porch, a smile on her face as she observed the revelry. "Dance with me?" he asked, holding out his hand. Without hesitation, she took it, allowing him to lead her into the circle of light, as Ezra's strong arms circled her waist. Abigail was aware of the hands watching, some nudging each other and grinning, but there was no mockery in their expressions, only approval, and perhaps a touch of envy. "They know," she murmured as they moved to the music. "They've known longer than we have," Ezra replied with a smile. "Ranch hands notice everything." As they danced beneath the vast Arizona sky, Abigail felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced in Boston. This was where she was meant to be on this land, with this man, building something that would last. The cattle drive to Tucson took 5 days of hard, dusty work. Abigail insisted on going, riding drag with the least experienced hands, eating the same beans and hardtack, sleeping under the same stars. By the time they reached the stockyards, she was indistinguishable from the other drovers except for her smaller stature and the braid of hair tucked up under her hat. The cattle brought even better prices than they had hoped. Beef was in high demand, and Silver Spur's steers were healthy and well fed. When the final calculations were made, they had enough to pay off the immediate debt to the bank with a comfortable margin remaining. Ezra and Abigail rode to the bank together, presenting Judge Wilson with the full amount due. The old judge, a contemporary of Thomas Montgomery, beamed with satisfaction. "I always knew Silver Spur would bounce back," he said, stamping the mortgage papers as paid. "Thomas would be proud to see his granddaughter and his protege working together to save his legacy." That evening, they celebrated their success with dinner at Tucson's finest restaurant, a luxury neither had allowed themselves in years. Cleaned up and dressed in their best clothes, they attracted admiring glances from other diners. "You clean up well, cowboy," Abigail teased across the table, admiring how handsome Ezra looked in his dark suit. "And you," he replied, his eyes appreciative of her blue silk dress. "Remind me that beneath the capable rancher is also a beautiful woman." Over steaks and wine, they discussed the future of Silver Spur, expanding the horse breeding operation, improving the water management, possibly adding sheep to diversify their income. Their plans were ambitious but achievable, built on a solid foundation of mutual respect and shared vision. As the evening wound down, Ezra reached into his pocket and placed a small box on the table between them. "What's this?" Abigail asked, her heart suddenly racing. "Open it," he said softly. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's," Ezra explained. "I've carried it with me for years, waiting for the right person." Abigail looked up at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Abigail Montgomery," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his face. "I know this is fast by Eastern standards. I know people might talk, but I love you, and I want to build a life with you at Silver Spur. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Abigail answered without hesitation. 1,000 times, yes." Ezra slipped the ring onto her finger, then leaned across the table to kiss her, heedless of the other diners. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears of joy. "When?" he asked. "As soon as possible," Abigail replied. "We've waited long enough." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Cottonwood Springs. The entire population of the town turned out, along with every hand from Silver Spur. Martha cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and declaring it the happiest day since Thomas and Elizabeth Montgomery's wedding 40 years earlier. Judge Wilson gave the bride away, proud as any father. Abigail wore a simple white dress ordered from Tucson with wildflowers in her hair. Ezra, nervous but determined, waited for her at the altar in a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up nearly raised the roof of the little church. Silver Spur's owners were united in law, as they already were in heart and purpose. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with dancing and feasting and more than a few emotional toasts to the couple who had saved the ranch against all odds. As the moon rose high over the festivities, Ezra took his bride's hand and led her away from the crowd. They mounted their horses, Ezra on his faithful gelding, Abigail on Penny, and rode slowly toward home. "Mrs. Vaughn," Ezra said, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. "Are you happy?" Abigail looked at her husband in the moonlight, her heart full to bursting. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." They stopped on the ridge where they had first confessed their feelings, gazing down at Silver Spur, their home, their future, their legacy. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound lonely yet beautiful in the vast night. "Your grandfather used to say that the land knows its people," Ezra said softly. "I think it knew you belonged here even before you did." "And it knew we belonged together," Abigail added, reaching across to take his hand. "From the moment I stood at that station with shaking hands, and you took my trunk and nodded homeward." Ezra smiled, squeezing her fingers. "Home," he agreed, "now and always." They rode down the slope toward the ranch house side by side, partners in every sense of the word. Behind them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns over the Arizona desert, witnesses to a love as enduring as the land itself. Epilogue. 5 years later. The spring roundup was finished, the new calves branded, and Silver Spur Ranch was thriving under the joint stewardship of Ezra and Abigail Vaughn. The mortgage was long paid off, the herds had doubled in size, and their quarter horses were now sought after throughout the territory. Abigail stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Ezra demonstrated roping technique to their 4-year-old son, Thomas. The boy's dark hair and green eyes marked him as his father's son, though he had Abigail's determined nature and quick mind. "Mama, look!" Thomas called excitedly as his small lasso settled around a fence post. "I did it!" "Wonderful, sweetheart," Abigail called back, clapping her hands. Beside her in a rocking chair sat Martha, now in her 60s, but still the heart of the household. In Martha's arms was the newest addition to the Vaughn family, 2-month-old Elizabeth, named for Abigail's grandmother. "That boy's a natural horseman," Martha observed proudly, "just like his father and great-grandfather." "And his mother," Abigail added with a smile. Her skills as a rancher had grown with each passing year, until now she was as respected in the territory as any male rancher, perhaps more so, given how she and Ezra had transformed Silver Spur from near ruin to prosperity. The sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. Old Pete rode up, now the ranch foreman since Ezra had moved into the role of owner. Despite his 70 years, Pete sat straight in the saddle, his leathery face creased in a smile. "Mail's in," he announced, handing Abigail several letters, including one from back east. Abigail recognized her aunt's handwriting immediately. After years of strained correspondence, Harriet had finally accepted her niece's unconventional life and was planning a visit in the fall to meet her grandniece and grandnephew. Ezra joined them on the porch, lifting Thomas onto his shoulders. "Anything important?" he asked, noticing the letters. "Just Aunt Harriet confirming her visit," Abigail replied, leaning into his side as his arm circled her waist. "And the bank statement, which I suspect will make for very pleasant reading this month." They had come so far from those uncertain days when Abigail had first arrived at Silver Spur. The hardships and struggles had forged their partnership, strengthened their love, and created a legacy they could pass on to their children. As the sun began to set, painting the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson, Abigail looked out at the land that had become so much more than an inheritance. It was home in the deepest sense, the place where she had found her purpose, her love, her family. Ezra seemed to read her thoughts, as he so often did now. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Abigail turned to face him, taking in the sight of her husband with their son on his shoulders and their daughter in Martha's arms nearby. Her heart swelled with gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, from a Boston lady to a rancher's wife, from an uncertain heir to a confident owner, from a woman alone to the center of a loving family. "Not one," she answered truthfully, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Every step led me exactly where I was meant to be." As darkness fell over Silver Spur Ranch, lamps were lit in the windows of the main house, casting warm golden light onto the porch where the Vaughn family gathered. Inside, the dinner table was set, the rooms were filled with laughter and conversation, and the walls held memories of generations past and promises of generations to come. In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the valleys and ridges, their voices echoing in the vastness of the Arizona night. Stars appeared one by one in the deepening blue of the sky, the same stars that had guided travelers across this land for centuries. And at the heart of it all stood Silver Spur Ranch, a testament to perseverance, hard work, and the transformative power of love. The love of a woman for a man, a family for their home, and two people for the land that had brought them together when Abigail Montgomery stood at the station till her hands shook, and Ezra Vaughn took her trunk and nodded homeward.